Welcome to a special edition of the Darden Admissions Podcast. I'm your host, Brett Twitty. So the podcast is taking a little bit of a break over the next week, and in honor of this occasion, we wanted to share a conversation from earlier this year that we really love. This conversation comes from Office Hours, our ongoing faculty spotlight series, and features Dean Emeritus Bob Bruner. Dean Bruner was the Dean of the Darden School of Business for 10 years. He taught at Darden for over 40 years, and he retired earlier this year. And it was such a treat to talk with him for this Office Hours conversation. We talked with him about his background, what brought him to Darden, what it was like being Dean of the business school. We also talk about his interest in financial crises and his recently published second edition of his book about the Panic of 1907. I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. So without further ado, here's our Office Hours conversation with Dean Emeritus Bob Bruner. Welcome, everyone, to our ongoing faculty conversation series, what we call Office Hours. I'm your host, Brett Twitty, and very pleased to be joined today by Dean Emeritus of the Darden School of Business, Bob Bruner. And I will say this is a particularly special Office Hours conversation. If you've been following some of the news here at the Darden School, maybe you've picked up that Dean Bruner is retiring at the end of this academic year after 41 years of teaching and service and leadership here at the school. Dean Bruner, thank you so much for joining us for Office Hours.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right. Well, we always start with the same first question for all of our participants. Tell us a little bit more about you. Who are you? What's your background?
So I was born in Chicago, grew up in Wisconsin, which for many of you who may not be familiar with the geography of the U.S. is in the upper Midwest of the country. It is a gorgeous part of the country and a great place to grow up. I moved off to New England, where I studied in college and graduate school. I worked as a banker for a few years in Chicago, and then returned to get my doctorate from Harvard Business School, where I also received my MBA, and was hired at Virginia. And I've been here ever since, although I've taken brief visitorships at other schools, typically outside of the U.S., but a couple here within. That's where I'm from.
Well, how did you get to Darden? What led you to the Darden School of Business?
I'd been a doctoral candidate at Harvard Business School, and upon finishing my degree requirements, looked around. It was a difficult job market for lots of reasons, a recession being the big reason. And several colleagues, professors, as well as friends, pointed me toward Virginia. I received a call from a professor here who said, "Why don't you come down and give a seminar, tell us about your work?" I did, and they offered me a job. My wife and I came back, we looked it over, and I sat in on some classes, and I was struck by a number of very important attributes of the school. One was its relatively smaller size compared to the business schools with which I was familiar up to that point. There was a genuine community feel within the school. The faculty were seriously devoted to the quality of the educational experience of the students. The students bonded deeply. They got to know one another. They socialized together. And as I've seen over many years, those bonds remain vital and alive and a source of support and some advantage to students as they pursue their careers thereafter. At any rate, I enjoyed the faculty community, and Charlottesville is a gorgeous place to spend a couple of years of your life as a residential student. I think no less an authority than USA Today has labeled Charlottesville, Virginia, as the #1 small town in the United States. It's pretty. It's near natural wonders, a national park, and yet not so far away from big cities. It's a cosmopolitan city. You can get sushi here just about 24 hours a day. Great South Asian food, East Asian, European, Latin. I could go on and on and on, but you have all the benefits of a wonderful, deep community, plus the cosmopolitanism that I referred to.
Well, you're a member of the finance faculty here at Darden, and you mentioned your background in banking. What got you interested in finance?
I had never studied economics in college. This is a humbling admission that I would make. And I went to business school, to Harvard, for my MBA, and it was like a bolt of lightning. I was instructed by a fellow named John MacArthur in my first year finance course, and something clicked. First of all, he was an outstanding instructor, but also the course really resonated with me. And I took a summer job in venture capital. That too resonated with me. I returned for the second year, took more finance courses, and in the duration of that year, received a wonderful job offer that I accepted. I worked for a few years in banking, and I discovered that what I really liked most about my work was discovering new insights about companies and industries and the whole economy, and then communicating those insights to other people. And a couple of professors of mine said, Bob, you seem to like academic work. And putting that together with the work I most enjoyed doing in finance, I decided to return and try academia. In any event, I've taught finance for virtually my entire career. There is a sense of great social service in finance. You're helping to mobilize capital, mobilize savings in pursuit of great ventures and projects, both public and private projects that can help society. You are at the forefront, typically dealing with senior management in your work and helping in major transactions such as mergers and acquisitions, which is a field in which I specialized and have written several books. You can help companies that are struggling, that are in deep distress, maybe even in bankruptcy. All of this is very, very fulfilling work. It is work that requires careful quantitative analysis. And as a card-carrying non-quant from my undergraduate work, I would tell everyone who feels maybe at any disadvantage in that regard not to worry, that a good business school education will help you get up to speed in a field such as finance and prepare you very well to do professional work in that field. Long story short, I love the sense of service, the intellectual challenges, the engagement with business at a high and strategic level, and many other reasons.
Well, you're someone that has a tremendous reputation for teaching and what you accomplished in the classroom. Did you always know that you wanted to teach? As you mentioned the sort of path of academics and being interested in these kind of questions, but teaching is something I know that you have a great passion for.
Yeah, if you look back, if any one of you look back on your life to date, you, I'm sure, would find 2, 3, 5, maybe 10 people who really resonated with you, who became examples and models for you, who helped you shape your own vision for what you'd like to do in the way of your life's work. And many of my models were teachers. They were people who helped me puzzle through the fields in which I was studying. And they did so in a way that helped me discover. They didn't tell me what to do. They didn't tell me what I needed to know, but they laid out before me a combination of materials, raw material, insights, problem settings, etc. And they suggested that I take a crack at solving these puzzles, and then they would work with me to sharpen up my analysis and the way I presented it. And at the end of every one of those courses, I would look back and say, gee, I feel lifted by the experience I had with this particular person. I did have a few of those experiences in my working career and in some other things I did, but by and large, the people who shaped my professional outlook the most were teachers, and that's what got me into this field.
I'm also curious about your interest in history. So you are an expert on financial crises, and on your blog, you talk a lot about historical moments. You've written a book on the Panic of 1907, which we'll talk about. What drives your interest in history, particularly given your interest in finance as well?
And many people have asked, how can you be a quantitatively oriented person and yet so qualitatively oriented in a field like history? And my answer is that the two fields are actually joined at the hip. I would argue that you cannot truly understand finance and economics without also knowing something about history, and the history not only of finance and economics, but also politics and culture and technology and the like. And therefore, I've started some courses at Darden and elsewhere in the University of Virginia that deal with the history of finance, economics, policy, democracy, capitalism, technology. And in all of those courses, the students have connected the dots of historical development and the challenges they will face today. In one course, a student openly queried, halfway into the course, gee, Bob, what's this course truly about? And I looked at the student and I said, this course is fundamentally about pattern recognition. And the student stopped for a moment, and then his eyes widened and, ding, he got it. And pattern recognition is a skill that is fundamental for successful practice in business, probably successful practice in politics, certainly in medicine, certainly in law and other fields. In business, it's really the ability to recognize problems of being a certain type and then connecting that recognition with tools of analysis and possible remedies that you've encountered before. And so studying history helps to burn into your memory the recognition of problems and remedies and a sense of how to move forward from a very dire situation.
I want to talk a little bit about your case writing too. And for our attendees today, in these conversations, we take about the first 20 minutes or so to kind of set a bit of background, and then we're going to turn our attention to some topical conversations. We're going to talk about Dean Bruner's book about the 1907 panic. We'll talk about his book about deals from hell, as well as the recent Silicon Valley Bank crisis. So stay tuned, more to come. But for now, Dean Bruner, I want to talk to you a little bit about case writing, because when you read your faculty description, you've published over 400 pieces of teaching materials, over 300 teaching case studies. What do you enjoy about case writing?
I have likened the writing of cases to being like the designer of crossword puzzles or word puzzles, word games, maybe tabletop games of any kind. I'm interested in framing a challenge for capable, motivated, eager people to wrestle with. And so for me, when I think about the teaching experience at Darden, when I design a course, for instance, I'll frame out a subject matter. I'll interview many practitioners. I will look at some of the major events in history that relate to that course, and then start writing cases that I would teach in the course, and the cases would each serve up a dilemma, maybe several dilemmas, and I try to engage such problems throughout the United States as well as around the world, problems that would engage practicing managers from the very top level of the CEO all the way down to the entry level, say a new MBA who enters a corporation and encounters a problem. It's important to recognize that sometimes what the protagonist of the case says is the problem is not the real problem. And helping an organization, helping an executive to discover what the real problem is quite often the challenge of a new MBA. You're hired, you're brought in to do a standard kind of analysis, but you put things together in a way and you realize this is not sustainable. And then how do you convey that to people up the ladder of decision making within an organization? So for me, the writing of a case is about shaping a learning experience, presenting a dilemma, a worthwhile dilemma to students who are, as I say, pretty intelligent, well-motivated, probably well-educated based on their prior studies, and then doing so in a way that we can have a very substantial discussion about both that dilemma as well as the deep underlying tools and concepts that can help resolve the dilemma, so that by the end of the case, students feel stronger, students feel a sense of satisfaction with the work they've been able to do, and so that the learning about those tools and concepts really stick in your memory. And that's why I think the case method is so powerful. You can memorize tools and formulas, and I promise you will forget those memorizations rather quickly. And they're available in textbooks. You should keep your textbooks and have them on the shelf for ready reference. But what you really want to stick are the way those tools and concepts might be applied, and what the strengths and weaknesses of them are, and to who else you might turn for advice, and so on. It's the process that Darden teaches. I often say that how we teach is what we teach. How we teach is what we teach. The how being by asking questions, by facing dilemmas, by puzzling through those in real time with teams of people, and by talking about our analyses and challenging one another about our assumptions and the work we've done and trying to arrive at a decision in every case. All of that creates what I call very sticky learning. And that's what you should want to get from 2 years in a business school.
It's interesting to hear your point around dilemmas, that the case is trying to point students towards a dilemma decision that has to be made. One of the things that I know you've also said is that in case method learning, each case is also a rehearsal for a dilemma to come, right? One that you haven't even experienced yet, but maybe this case can help you understand how to solve that future dilemma. There's
some wonderful research about what it takes to become an excellent performer. How do you become a master's level golf player, or a Wimbledon level tennis player, or a violinist at Carnegie Hall, or world-class physicist? All of the research suggests that it stems from many, many, many hours of what's called, quote unquote, directed practice. So you practice. In golf, you practice a swing, you swing, you do it again. But it isn't just the hours. It's doing it with a coach, with someone who's watching you and helping you think things through. And at Darden, you will study probably 500 cases over the course of a 2-year residential MBA experience. And every one of those cases is like a practiced golf swing. It's a rehearsal for some dilemmas that you're going to face in the future. You don't know what, but it's like the tennis player or the golfer. You go to different tennis courts or different golf courses. You don't know what you're going to find, but that memory, that muscle memory in the case of athletics, or that mental memory in the case of an MBA education is the whole thing. It's the whole reason for getting a degree program education. So each case is like a practice swing at problems in business that, as I said a moment ago, the rote part of learning you will likely forget, but it's always available in a textbook or online. You can access it any of these formulas very easily today. What matters is the mental memory that a good 2-year MBA program should create to help set you up for success in professional life.
I want to talk a little bit about your time as dean. And I will say, Dean Bruner, as I was preparing for this conversation, there's so much ground to cover, but I want to make sure we have some time to talk about your time as dean here at the Darden School. You served as dean from 2005 to 2015. And I know it's hard. This is maybe an impossible question, but for you, when you think back on that decade, was there a highlight or two, something that stands out for you from that experience?
I could talk about many things. When you take a senior leadership position of any kind, you will be challenged and stretched in unexpected new ways. And my advice to all of you would be ready. And again, that's where education counts so very much, to be ready. I would tell you that being a senior leader is challenging, and the challenges are many of them are gratifying. Some of them are astonishing. Some are quite difficult. But I look back on those 10 years and I regard them to be the most fulfilling thing I've done in professional life. Obviously, I'm married. I have a family. Those I would regard as the most fulfilling aspects of my life. But I've written numerous books, articles, teaching materials. I've taught lots of courses, traveled a lot professionally, but serving as dean of the school still ranks as the most fulfilling thing I've done. And the reason for that is that I and the entire faculty and staff of the school rallied around a vision for Darden that has since proven to be quite successful for us, and the basis for Darden's high stature globally. You may know that Darden is typically ranked as the #1 teaching MBA school in the world. We do a lot of serious research. We're very good on that score. We serve many good social purposes. We help people in lots of ways. But what I'm proudest of is the commitment of our community to serve students, and actually to serve the business profession by serving students very well, because every year we send hundreds of students out into the world, and we hope that those students will do great things in the world. But for us to be a great teaching school means that we have had to commit to developing original courses, original teaching materials, stuff you can't get anywhere else, taught by world-class teachers, people with energy, people with passion for their subject matter, people who care about the students and want to make time to be with the students, people who connect with students outside of class, even on weekend events or over the summers. I still connect with my former students online and in meetings that I go to regularly. But all of that requires a very, very special kind of culture that endorses that deep kind of engagement between students and faculty. And I'm proud that we have that.
Well, I'd like to transition now to talk about some of your publications. So your book about the Panic of 1907, which was co-written with Sean Carr, who was formerly leader of the Batten Institute here at the Darden School of Business. It's now in its second edition. Second edition came out in early March. I gather that you added about 150 new pages to the second edition, which it seems that sounded like a lot to me from first edition to second edition. But I want to talk a bit about how you got interested in this panic in the first place. When we think about, I will say as someone who's maybe a bit of a layperson here, when you think about financial crises in American history, maybe you hear about Great Depression, you hear about other moments, but I was not super familiar with the panic of 1907. I imagine a lot of people on this call, this may be the first time they're hearing about it. So how did you get interested in this?
Well, that warms my heart to hear you say it. And the reason you didn't know about it is that subsequent events have vastly overshadowed it. But it turns out that the Panic of 1907 was one of the pivotal episodes in the financial history of the U.S. And indeed, it spilled over into other countries in the world. It was actually an international crisis. But I got into it in a roundabout way. So when I did my doctoral studies in finance, financial economics is the technical name of the field of my specialty. But when I did my doctoral studies, the belief was that markets were perfect and efficient and could always be trusted to give you the right signals about the future. If the market declined, the market was telling you, look out, there's going to be a recession. If the market rose, it seemed the market was telling you, the future is bright, be prepared for that. But about 15, 20 years after I graduated, the new research began to suggest that markets were not always perfectly rational. And I dove deeply into that research. I was very interested in it. I'm curious about a lot of subjects. Psychology is one of them. And the behavioral aspects of finance have subsequently proven to be extraordinarily important to understand how markets, financial markets function, how financial decision makers decide what to do, what they do, and so on. And as a way to sharpen my understanding of the field, I decided to look at some of the biggest anomalies in finance. Where does the finance world seem to perform most irrationally would be the question I had in mind, and bingo, financial crises emerged as I continued to do my reading. And so I decided to study one of the financial crises in great depth. I focused on the crisis of 1907 because it led to the establishment of a central bank in the United States, the Federal Reserve System here, which has now today enormous influence globally. And the question is, well, how did the central bank come into being? And the answer is, well, the crisis of 1907 triggered a dramatic change in public policy and public sentiment in favor of having a central bank, because theretofore U.S. policymakers had resisted it. It's a long story, and I can get into the details of that if you would like, but suffice it to say, I have gone on to write a lot about financial crises. I'm still writing about it. I expect to keep writing about crises well into the future, but the course that I founded on the history of financial crises is quite popular, and it looks at crises from 1720 up to 2023. And there are some recurrent patterns and some things that anybody, a financial specialist or even a general manager, ought to bear in mind. Mark Twain, the American writer, once said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. It rhymes. And so if you really understand an event like the Panic of 1907, the odds are you'll be able to make better sense about the current financial instability we're seeing, or about the crisis of 2020 or 2008 or the Great Depression. And indeed, that's one of the big lessons of that course.
Well, I want to pull out some of your key takeaways from the Panic in 1907. There's a number of them, but there are a couple that really, I guess, surprised me. So one of them is that this relationship between economic boom periods and financial crises. Things are going really well. I think we always assume, oh, it'll just keep going so well, and yet you note that there is a relationship. When things are going really well, they're oftentimes followed by a financial crisis. It's interesting to me.
Brett, you've identified one of the big behavioral discoveries, those who study behavioral finance, and there's a tendency for decision makers to be biased toward the most recent experience. They tend to take the past, I don't know, whatever shocking or delightful experience they've had, and project it into the future almost linearly. And this is a very dangerous thing to do, because there's very little about finance and economics, or about life in general, that's linear. And to be able to understand how farther into the future current conditions might prevail before they change is one of the deep skills that an MBA education can help you develop. So you mentioned the word boom. What a boom refers to is a period of growth in economic conditions. Buoyant times, it's typically measured by growth in gross domestic product, also called GDP, and or measured by GDP per person, or GDP per capita, as the technical phrase is. And the GDP will grow for a period, and then it'll peak. The economy will have reached its full capacity, and then companies will begin to cut back on capital investment. Consumers will begin to say, "Gee, I don't how many more filet mignons can I consume? I'm going to start eating hamburger for a while, etc." So this leads to a downturn. Most booms do not result in a financial crisis, but some booms do. And the book details some of the attributes of booms that are crisis prone. They tend to be booms in which credit, particularly the credit offered by banks or other lenders, expands very greatly. And the expansion of credit is generally a good thing. It helps companies raise the money to expand their businesses. It helps consumers buy a house or a second car for the family or whatever. But booms in credit are also associated with speculation and the overreach by financial decision makers to commit too much money in very dubious ways. And sooner or later, the realization of the impact of those speculations causes a sharp redirection. I can't stop here. I need to add that typically every crisis begins with an economic shock of some kind, which really makes financial decision makers reassess how wise their recent spending and investing has been, and they will begin to cut back sharply, and thus the crisis accelerates. But so look for booms that grow very sharply and are associated with extreme growth in lending and credit, and then with sharp increases in speculation, are episodes to be very, very careful about.
That reminds me of another one of your takeaways, that banking by its nature creates fragility. That this lending, I guess you can stretch too far in some ways.
Banks are fragile, plain and simple. And over the years, the United States and almost all countries have gone to great efforts to put in place regulations to help stabilize the banking system, the financial system. But still, the instability remains, and it arises because banks perform a very important function in society. They transform money. They take deposits from people like you and me, individual depositors, and they guarantee that we'll be able to get our money out on demand. So, in theory, we could put the money in today and take it out tomorrow. That's called, the bank is borrowing from us short term. That's called borrowing short. And banks, on the other hand, take that money and aim to make a profit by lending it out at a higher rate of return, but typically that requires them to commit to the people who borrow from banks that they can have that money for a longer period of time. Might be 3 months, might be a year, might be 5 years. It could be a 30-year mortgage. And so you see right there, banks borrow short and they lend long. And that becomes a problem when depositors, people like you and me, start to worry about the bank and decide to take our deposits out. And that's called a run on the bank. And a run on the bank will threaten the stability of the bank, might force it into insolvency. Fortunately, the government provides some insurance for our deposits up to a certain amount, but that instability is what's behind the notion that the financial system is fragile. And a good MBA program will help you deepen your understanding of systemic fragility and indeed your understanding of systemic crises. But much of the story about what we're witnessing today in the US and Britain and many other countries stems from that inherent fragility in banking.
Interesting to think about a bank run in this current context where we are much more networked than we ever have been. Information flows much more quickly, and banking is largely digital now. How to think about things like a bank run in this current age?
It means that the development of a run could now become extremely active. What we observed in the panic of 1907 was that a run developed over the course of a week or 10 days. And even at the peak, the banks were, many financial institutions were able to service the depositors and give them their money back, but the weakest banks were not. They suspended, as the saying goes, and were thrown into insolvency. But today, what it means is you need to be very, very attentive to conditions in financial markets because money moves at the speed of an email. This is an era of what I'd call hot money. The phrase hot money is a phrase you'll come to learn about in economics and in finance at Darden, but it refers to the flows of savings and capital from one bank to another, or from a bank into the stock market, or from the stock market back into U.S. government securities, which are very safe. It could refer to flows of capital across borders. Today, countries such as Turkey and Sri Lanka are experiencing great financial difficulty for a host of reasons, but in no small part because of the flow of capital, the flow of hot money out of those economies. And being able to recognize the circumstances of hot money flows, it will be important, especially for those of you who pursue a career in finance.
Panic of 1907, you mentioned pattern recognition, you mentioned history rhyming. Is there anything that we can learn from Panic of 1907 to help us understand what happened in 2008? Are there similarities between the financial crisis in 2008 and what happened 100 years or so prior?
Oh, there are many similarities, although we need to be careful that we don't over equate the crises. Looked at in minute detail, the crises seem to be incredibly different, but there are some regularities from crisis to crisis. First of all, there were booms in 1907 and in 2008, and in 2023. There were shocks. There were triggering events that led to the onset of the crisis cycle. In 1907, there was an earthquake in San Francisco that triggered a wave of insurance claims that triggered the flows of money out of money centers in Europe and into the US that caused central banks around the world to react in adverse ways. The situation worsened. In the US, the shock was the sudden plummet in house prices. Everybody, most people, virtually all people believed that house prices would only rise over time, and yet to everyone's shock and surprise, they began to fall in the mid-2000s, and that triggered sharp declines in the value of mortgages, particularly the riskiest kinds of mortgages called subprime debt. And the defaults on subprime debt led to the failure of shadow banks. That's the third regularity I would highlight. In all crises, the epicenter of the crisis breaks out in the shadows, not in the center. There's a good op-ed in today's Wall Street Journal by Joseph Sternberg, who refers to this, but I've written about it. Others have. The shadow segment of the financial system would consist of smaller and less well-regulated and perhaps more aggressively managed pension funds, money market funds, insurance companies perhaps, hedge funds certainly would be in that category, mortgage loan originators, but people who are networked into the banking system in very important ways can do stupid things. Let's be blunt about it, and their failures of judgment then spill over into the center of the financial system, into the big financial institutions. So those three attributes: the boom, the shock, the outbreak in the shadows. Typically, there's some contagion into the rest of the financial system, and I'll stop there. I love talking about this subject, but I won't poach into the time for Q&A with all of you in the audience.
Well, I'll ask a question that's very timely, right? So we're talking about financial crises. Unfortunately, we had a recent one here with Silicon Valley Bank. I know you've been talking about this recent crisis. You've written about it on your blog. There's a great recent session that you participated in that the University of Virginia's Miller Center hosted, talking about financial crises and touching on the current day. What do you make of the Silicon Valley Bank crisis? How can we think about this, understand this particular crisis?
The immediate failure of Silicon Valley Bank was a crisis of management brought on by the bank itself. It had positioned its assets in long-term bonds, heavily in long-term bonds, which, here we go, the triggering event was the very sharp rise in interest rates caused by the central bank of the US, the Federal Reserve System. Nobody expected interest rates to rise this fast, this quickly, this so soon. And the bank was unprepared. The asset portfolio of the bank caused substantial losses at the bank. And when the depositors began to fear the impact of the losses, they triggered a run. And the bank had to be closed before all of its resources were exhausted. And the regulators took it over and so on. But that bank, the failure of that bank occurred in the context of the failure of some other shadow financial institutions, banks who were smaller banks who were closely affiliated with the cryptocurrency field. They were associated with the near failures of pension funds in the UK. There are fears about the stability of the commercial finance market in the US. Now with work from home and hybrid work, companies may not need to have the extensive investment in office space. So you can see that there are lots of deeper things happening in the U.S. economy and the economies of countries around the world that we're still trying to figure out. Surely the venture capital firms were shadow finance institutions that had a big influence on triggering the runs. They encouraged the tech companies out in the San Francisco Bay Area to withdraw their cash deposits from Silicon Valley Bank and other banks very quickly. Suffice it to say, the deeper cause of this current distress is the turmoil induced, and this is my theory, my thesis. I'm writing about it, but I'll give you the advance notice. The deeper trigger is the pandemic of 2020 to 2022, and the reaction of governments and central banks around the world to flood their economies with money in an effort to keep the economies from going into a tailspin. I think we all agree that was a noble intention. In the United States, I think some of the better judgment today includes that the government and the central bank here overdid it. They put too much money out there, and sure enough, in the winter of 2022, inflation began to rise sharply. So the central bank did what we want central banks to do, and that reacted to impose some policies aimed at reducing inflation, namely by taking money out of the economy and by raising interest rates. Well, we're dealing with that now, and that has triggered instability in these smaller, less well-managed, perhaps less well-regulated shadow banking sectors. And I predict that it will take at least another year for us to work through the crisis conditions here. It looks like the Fed is going to continue to raise rates in an effort to bring inflation down. Inflation is running at about a 5 to 6% annual rate right now, which is not healthy for our economy or any economy, truly. And you should know that inflation is a hidden tax on consumers and companies, and causes all kinds of social instability. We want our countries to be rid of inflation, and if I would fault government leaders in any way, it would be they have not taken that case to the public very effectively. But many academics are beginning to carry that message, and we'll see whether it becomes a sticky piece of learning.
It's interesting to think about the government role in response to financial crises. This idea that, well, you certainly saw it in 2008 with the bank bailouts, a little bit different in this particular moment with the FDIC limit being raised, basically saying we'll make all of the depositors at these banks whole. But nevertheless, it feels like government's in a tough position because you want to quell whatever is going on, to respond forcefully, but yet you could potentially create a moral hazard for other banks or other financial actors down the road where they know that a bailout is coming no matter what happens because the systemic risk is too great. How I mean, what have you learned from studying the government response to these kind of financial crises?
So moral hazard is a phrase, is a very, very important phrase. And if the audience, members of the audience have not encountered it, you should become familiar, and a good MBA education will help you gain that familiarity. But it refers to the tendency of people to abuse insurance of all kinds. You can think of the health insurance. If we have government guaranteed health insurance, the risk is that you and I might undertake a lifestyle that would be very risky, or much riskier or ill-advised, in the belief that you and I might have that we can always turn to the medical system and the government will pay for the treatment and we'll be cured and so on. People who have other kinds of insurance might tend to behave in risky fashion in the belief that no matter what, they'll be made whole. So it is on the part of financial decision makers and banks. They might believe that if they do some wild and crazy things, the government will always step in to rescue them and turn them around. Surely, if a bank is big enough and extensively wired into the financial system, extensively connected, and the government has a strong incentive to rescue that bank. So there's a phrase called too big to fail or too interconnected to fail, which prompts governments to step forward. And some of the biggest financial institutions would be in that category. In turn, governments have decided to subject those very big financial institutions to extremely intensive supervisory scrutiny and management regulatory oversight. So that's kind of the response. But moral hazard is a general idea that you need to be careful about this. This could exist in any organization, any business you're in. If you're a manager who repeatedly bails out a protege, the protege could well begin to assume, hey, I'm so well liked by my boss that no matter what happens, I'm always going to have a job, and look out. So be careful about the signals you send. I think that the immediate concern here is that the U.S. government stepped in virtually to guarantee the deposits of any size of Silicon Valley Bank. And that has created an expectation that the government would do the same for any other bank here in the U.S. And if so, that those banks would be free to do as they will. And we do want the discipline of markets to help managers make sound decisions. It really has to do with helping resources to be allocated to their best and highest use in an economy. And if managers stop paying attention to the discipline of markets, the risk is that we will have zombie banks, as has been the case in some foreign countries where, and potentially here in the US, where governments have stepped in to rescue banks, and banks that are essentially insolvent, that is to say bankrupt, that is to say their assets are worth less than all the liabilities that they owe. And that's terrible. We in those cases, we ought to let the market discipline work. We ought to help those companies, those banks, through a resolution process where lawyers would divide up the assets of the bank and send them off to healthier institutions, wiser institutions, presumably, who would be able to apply those resources in more sensible ways. So there's a there's a downside to government rescues. There's moral hazard. There's the risk of zombie institutions and misallocation of capital. But I don't think we're there quite yet, but it's useful at this point in time for us to bear it in mind and watch closely to be sure that government decision makers are held accountable to the policies they adopt.
I have a couple more questions for you, Dean Bruner. The first question relates to, we have a number of incoming students who will be starting here at Darden in August, in full-time MBA, part-time MBA, executive MBA programs. What's a piece of advice you would share with them as they prepare for their MBA journeys?
Darden offers some wonderful pre-registration courses if you have an opportunity to take them, getting up to speed on some of the quantitative aspects of the MBA program would be a good idea. And this would be true for attending any MBA program. These would be courses in accounting, basically double entry bookkeeping, to learn some of the language there. It's a very interesting subject and worth your time. Learning a little bit about how to build an Excel spreadsheet model, learning a little bit about how to estimate the present value of a stream of future cash flows. All of this can be found at Darden in the form of pre-registration programs. You just come a week or two early. It's actually kind of a fun way to get to know some classmates and to find your way around school and around the city. But there are also many online courses, some very good, some for free, others for hire. But I would do that. My second piece of advice was suspend your assumptions. Come into the MBA program eyes wide open and energized and eager to engage with classmates, eager to participate, eager to work hard, and you'll get the maxi. I think that, so in my field in finance, again and again, I've seen over the years students who've worked in the finance field and investment banking, for instance, might come in and say, I know all of this stuff. And within a few weeks, their eyes are rolling. My gosh, why didn't anybody tell me about this? And so even to people who bring some field experience, some work experience in a particular field, suspend your preconceptions. And my third and final piece of advice would be to trust the process. If we will create learning teams who will meet typically the night before every day when cases are taught. And in those learning teams, you're invited to share your thoughts and concepts about a case with each other and participate in those. Don't assume that it's time less well spent. Believe me, even if you're a field expert, you will learn a lot by helping to explain some ideas to the other members of your learning team or the other members of your section. So do a little pre-work, suspend your preconceptions, and trust the process. It really works.
So you've been at Darden for over 40 years, and I'm curious, when you think back on your experience here, what's kept you here so long? What has Darden meant to you?
Darden has meant so much. It is an extraordinary community. I really, I can't find the comparable like of it. It is a relatively smaller, but community that is with very deep bonding. It's in a lovely place. We are devoted to the quality of the MBA learning experience. I have visited at many other schools. I respect them all. but I find few or none who rise to the level of deep commitment of our faculty and staff. And that's what sets Darden apart. Think of Darden as a very, very high-end restaurant. You can go get fast food at some restaurants. You can get takeout. You can buy the ingredients yourself and cook at home. People who come to Darden come because they want an intense learning experience with other great students. The students who come to us tend to be students who want to be challenged, who want to be stretched. As I've said in other ways, eagles, the national bird of the United States. Eagles tend to flock together. They want to be where other high performance people are, and they don't want to be lectured at for 2 years. You got plenty of that in undergraduate school, I'm sure. They want to come here because they want to mix it up. They want to engage with other great students and with some of the best teaching faculty in the world. I adore that culture. I think Darden is special. I have stayed with the school all these years because I've really bonded with the values of the school and what we stand for.
Well, this is the last question. You are a book lover. I'm not going to let you get out of here without making some book recommendations. I will say to our attendees today, if you haven't checked out Dean Bruner's blog, highly recommend it. Every year, this is one of my favorite posts. Every year he shares a book roundup, things that he's read that he would particularly recommend. So Dean Bruner, for our attendees today, if they've gotten interested in the things that we've talked about here, what are 3 books you would recommend for them?
I am currently reading a book by Roger Lowenstein called Ways and Means, and it's about how the United States government of the North, as well as the Confederate government of the South, financed their respective armies in the U.S. Civil War. It's a remarkable saga in financial history and quite instructive of some of the larger lessons of this course that I developed on financial crises. A second book that I highly recommend is a book by Charles Dickens. He's a British author in the 19th century, and the book is titled A Tale of Two Cities, and it's really about the French Revolution. The two cities are London and Paris, and it's about the difficulties of a wealthy family in France to deal with the legacy of being part of the nobility, part of the elites of France in the time of a revolution. One of the heroes of the book is a fellow named Jarvis Lorry, who's a private banker. Think of that. You don't see many private bankers being heroes in novels. Charles Dickens thought that A Tale of Two Cities was his favorite work of literature. I would say that I'm currently reading some books about meritocracy, and perhaps the most provocative of these books is a book by Daniel Markovits, and it's titled The Meritocracy Trap. I think for all of us in academia, as well as for all of you who are surely the beneficiaries of systems of the recognition of merit, you would do well to consider both the criticisms of what we have today, which is a meritocratic system, as well as its strengths. So I would recommend those 3 to provoke your thinking.
Well, Dean Bruner, thank you so much for coming on Office Hours. It was such a pleasure. We covered so much ground here. Thank you for answering all my questions, and to our attendees, thank you for joining us as well. These events are such a pleasure, so much fun, sharing the incredible faculty here at the Darden School of Business with you. As always, we'll share out the recording from this conversation on our admissions podcast, Experience Darden, and the ExecMBA podcast, and be sure to keep an eye on the Discover Darden blog for video from this session. But have a wonderful weekend, and thank you so much for joining and for your interest in the Darden School of Business.
Best of luck, everybody.
And that was our office hours conversation with Dean Emeritus Bob Bruner from April 2023. As always, if you have any comments, suggestions, requests, anything you'd like for us to cover here on the podcast, we're all ears. We can be reached at Darden, that's Darden, @virginia.edu. Till next time, stay safe, be well, and thanks for listening.